So you just heard Mesa tell us about tonight. It's a little bit different. Usually we preach sermons during the service, which means you take a portion of Scripture and you explain what it means and how that applies to how God is speaking to us through that text, today. But tonight we're doing it a little bit differently. If you had to categorize it, I guess it's maybe a lecture of sorts. And those of you uni students who are like, oh man, another lecture, I don't know, too bad. So, as we were preparing for this, as Mesa mentioned, tonight we're talking about pain and evil and suffering, and so it's a serious topic, and it's a topic that brings with it a lot of emotion. It has a lot of nuance and philosophical and theological input and maturity that is needed. So, I figured doing it by myself probably wouldn't be good. We figured, okay, we need someone with a little bit more maturity and who can add theological insight to this topic, and not just me. So I asked Mark if he could ask Andrew to come.
That guy wasn't here, so he asked me, yeah.
Andrew couldn't make it, so we just have to do with Mark.
The bald guy, right? Yeah,
yeah, the bald guy. But that's a sign of, like, age and wisdom.
That's right,
right?
suffering,
yeah.
right? You know.
Yeah, it certainly is. He's a doctor. We can verify that. So, so what we're going to do tonight, we're talking about this topic. And the reason we're doing that is because this is one of the biggest questions that people have against Christianity, or maybe more broadly speaking, against the existence of God. We look around the world, we see so much pain, we see suffering and all this bad stuff happening that people will say, man, God possibly couldn't be real, or he couldn't exist if all this stuff is happening. So for us, I guess if you are a Christian, this is the reason we're addressing this is so that we can, I guess, understand it, so that we can be equipped to give a reasonable response when someone says, no, God can't be real because of all the bad stuff that happens in the world. So that's kind of one reason why we're doing it, to be equipped apologetically. Apologetics just means giving a defense for the faith. And I just want to really emphasize something that tonight, what we're going to be dealing with, like I said, it's kind of a lecture. This is a intellectual or philosophical reasoning as to why God allows evil and suffering. And so if you have come in this evening and you yourself are going through some kind of season of pain or suffering, what you hear tonight probably isn't going to give you any comfort. What we're doing tonight isn't really to give you, ironically, two pastors here. We're not here to give you kind of a pastoral perspective on it, to help you to go through your suffering. We're taking it from the angle of kind of like, this is how we are to intellectually understand this. If someone is suffering, the stuff that we talk about tonight, it's going to mean nothing. If someone is suffering and they ask us, hey man, why would God allow this? Like, the answer isn't to go through the 4 points that we give tonight. The correct answer is really to just say, man, I don't know. It sucks what you're going through, but I don't know why. And to just sit there with your friend, maybe put your arm around them, give them a hug, and just let them know that you support them. That's not a time to give intellectual responses as to why God might allow something. So those are kind of two distinctions that we need to make. This is what the kind of angle that we're taking tonight. But as you carry on, Mark, do you want to just, briefly, just talk us through kind of why evil exists, why we experience it, what the Bible has to say, why that happens.
Hey, thanks, Han. Yeah, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Mark. Again, just one of the pastors here at church. And great question. Just going to give a short answer to that. The Bible teaches us that God has created a world, and as you read through Genesis, he repeatedly says it's good, this thing that he's created. And in that goodness, he's also given man, or humanity actually, the capacity for a free will, right? And that is to honor and to worship God, and to follow him or not. And I suppose all pain and suffering, according to the Bible, according to Scripture, comes back to that very first point of humanity choosing not to follow God, and choosing not to honor him. Suffering relationally, suffering and pain throughout our world, because of the dominion and caretaking role that God had given to us from that very beginning. So, this is an idea we're going to flesh out. So I know it's kind of like a general kind of up here answer, but that's what we're going to be kind of talking about tonight. We're going to be giving our thoughts about how that plays out in a couple of different areas.
Sweet, thanks. So this evening, how it's going to run, we're looking at two separate categories, and we're going to have a break in between, just to kind of break it up. And we'll have a chance to say hi to each other and sign up for dinner, which, by the way, I've been told that dinner is gluten-free and something else. Oh. Yep, so there's GF and vegetarian. So, just there you go. So you'll have a chance to sign up for those as well. Cool. So there's evil. Tonight we're separating evil and suffering. So the kind of two distinctions we want to make from that is evil are things that are pertaining to bad things that happen because people make bad things happen. Okay? And then there's suffering, which kind of is a different category of, it doesn't necessarily have to be brought on by people doing bad things. Right? Anyone here watch The Crown? Yeah, okay, cool. So I was watching The Crown last night, and I watched this episode about this landslide in Wales that happened in 1966. Does you know? You don't need to watch The Crown to know this. Anyway, it's just like this landslide happened and people died, you know? I guess actually in that example you can blame the engineers and stuff. But we kind of, sometimes you might hear it as an act of God, right? Where some hurricane happens or a tornado comes through and suffering takes place because of that. So one is kind of perpetrated by people and one is just accidents or suffering that just takes place. So we're looking at those two things separately. The first half is evil, that bad stuff that happens because of people doing bad things. As we kind of unpack this, why does God allow evil to exist? My main point tonight in answering this is kind of this. To answer this question of why does God allow evil to exist, it's something of a futile or meaningless or pointless, if I can say that, endeavor. It's kind of a futile endeavor that we're not really going to get to the bottom of, and you'll see, as we unpack this, you'll see why. So I want to give two reasons. The first reason why God allows evil to exist is because God wants free will to exist. Mark kind of alluded to that before, but by definition, for free will to exist, the option of evil has to be there, right? If I say, hey, you can choose A or B, but remove the option B and say, hey, you can only choose A or A, there's no option of B, right? And so when God created the world and when God created people, for whatever reason, God chose that I'm going to create a world of people where they have free will. They are allowed to choose to obey me. They're allowed to choose to live by what I say is good, or they're allowed to choose otherwise. So by definition, for free will to exist, the possibility of evil has to exist. Otherwise, there's no free will. So that's like a pretty straightforward answer. Like, why does God allow evil to exist? Well, because he wants free will to exist. Now, suppose, we're going to do a lot of supposing and mental gymnastics tonight. Suppose that we're like, rah, God, why do you let evil exist? And God was like, okay, sweet. I'll create another world. I'll create another world over here, a parallel universe, in which there is no evil. I'm going to get rid of all evil, and therefore, by definition, there can't be free will in this world. So God creates a world over there where there's no free will. Do you know what we would say then? We would go, rah, God, how could you? How dare you create people who have no free will and are not able to choose anything for themselves? So hopefully you're starting to see why I say this is kind of a futile question to kind of think about, because we can't really get to the bottom of it. So that's one reason. God allows evil to exist because he wants free will to exist. Secondly, God allows free will to exist because he wants people to exist. God wants people to exist. That's our second point. So I guess God could have stopped the Holocaust, right? Like, so we might look at something as terrible as the Holocaust and go, like, man, God, why did you not intervene in that situation? Why did you not stop the Holocaust where 6 million Jewish people were killed, right? And God might respond to that and say, okay, sweet, let's do it. I'll intervene and stop it. And so God answers our prayers retrospectively, and he goes back in time and decides to take 12-year-old Adolf Hitler and has him get run over by a truck. So God kills Adolf Hitler at age 12 and stops the Holocaust. Do you know what we would say then? How dare God allow this innocent 12-year-old to die and cause this evil and suffering where an innocent child's life has been taken? Right? Again, you're starting to see why this is kind of a futile mental exercise. So we would complain about that, but then you might go, no. God doesn't need to kill 12-year-old Hitler. God could just cause Hitler not to be born, right? So when Mama Hitler and Daddy Hitler, and instead of Adolf being conceived, God's God, he could have been like, zap, that fertilization, that's going to be little Olga, right? So God could have done that, right? And it's like, cool, sure, God could have done that. God could have stopped Hitler from being created, and young Olga, well, I guess surname would still be Hitler, but she wouldn't be Adolf. So God could do that, and then we might be like,
I was going to say, he didn't need to create men at all, really, Just get rid of men, and there goes all the violence and problems, right?
Well, exactly, right? So we could look at that and be like, sweet, Adolf Hitler, God's going to intervene and stop him from being created. God's going to stop Pol Pot. God's going to stop Genghis Khan. God's going to stop Mao Zedong. God's going to stop Mussolini, Stalin, all of these people who have just perpetrated evil things on planet Earth. God could have done that, right? But then we would just be like, okay, where's the line? At what point does God stop people from coming into conception? Right? So this isn't a political statement, what I'm about to say. So you take someone like Barack Obama, who, if you watch the news or read anything online, you'll be like, man, Barack Obama was the greatest president of all time and just a perfect human being and can do no wrong, and he had no scandals in his presidency and whatnot. Again, this is nothing to do with politics. But this is an example of someone who we revere as like an amazing, awesome person, Barack Obama, right? But did you know he has the blood of like 1,000 civilians on his hands? Because he ordered these airstrikes. We're not talking about one or two. We're not talking like even hundreds, but we're talking over 1,000 civilians killed because of airstrikes that he commanded, right? And again, this isn't a political thing. I'm just trying to say, like, someone who we revere as the model citizen has the deaths of 1,000+ civilians on his hands. So, okay, isn't Barack Obama a good guy? Should God have stopped Barack Obama from being conceived? Right? Where's the line? Where do we draw that line? Okay, dictators, yeah, cool, yeah, get rid of them. But what about Barack Obama? Oh, I don't know about that. You look at, people on the stage right now. I have 0 kills to my name. Unless you're talking about Counter-Strike, then, man, I was I was really good back in my day. But anyway, I have 0 kills to my name, but, like, I'm one of the biggest jerks I know. I'm insensitive. I'm prone to anger and bitterness. So like, okay, sure, I haven't ordered any airstrikes. I haven't, killed 6 million Jews, but like, Habakkuk 1:13 says, your eyes about God, your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing, right? So should God just get rid of people who has caused physical harm or death? You know, like this is what the Bible says about all of us. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Isaiah 53, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. 1 John 1:8, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. So it's like, man, okay, I'll speak for myself. Neither of us have killed anyone, but we're sinners. We commit sins. We perpetrate and add to the evil that is in this world. So if we're talking about God should intervene and not allow evildoers to come into conception, then where do we draw this line? You know, again, coming back to our point, God allows evil to exist because he wants people to exist. So it's like, where do we draw the line? Every single one of us would have to be gone if God was going to get rid of evil. But you might come back and push back against that again and say, okay, fine. God doesn't need to stop people coming into conception, but why doesn't God supernaturally intervene? Right? So when the Jews were chucked into the gas chambers and the concentration camp said, like, no, you're going in there for a shower, but actually they were killing them with gas. When the Jews went in those gas chambers, why didn't God supernaturally intervene and supernaturally actually turn it into a nice hot shower? Right? Like, why didn't he do that? God supernaturally intervened to... so like the atheist would say, God allegedly supernaturally intervened when they came out of Egypt with the plagues and parting of the Red Sea and all that stuff. Why doesn't he do it again and do that? And it's like, fine, okay, we want God to supernaturally intervene like that. The question is, why doesn't God supernaturally intervene? I have two responses to that. And again, my point is, this is a futile mental exercise. The first response to why doesn't God supernaturally intervene is, again, where do we draw the line? Second one is, how do we know God hasn't already supernaturally intervened? Okay, so the first one, where's the line? If God is supposed to, if we're kind of demanding God to stop evil from happening by supernaturally intervening, again, where is the line? Is it war, right? So let's say Pearl Harbor, the Japanese forces fly into the States and drop bombs, and then is God supposed to intervene in those? Okay, cool, let's say he does. But then should he intervene when it comes to terrorism? So 9/11, those two planes fly into the towers. Should God have, I don't know, done something to intervene in those situations? Where's the line? Is it injuries during sport, right? Should God have intervened in 2014 when Ronaldo got that serious knee injury, right? Because that caused him a lot of suffering and me even more. So, like, where is the line that God is meant to supernaturally intervene to prevent evil and suffering from taking place?
He did intervene. He created...
no, don't say it. Don't even go there, Mark. I know what you...
But Messi's so good, like, you know.
Good at being a fraud. So we just don't know where we're supposed to draw this line of God, you have to intervene to stop evil things taking place. And suppose we set some... No, let's suppose God set some arbitrary line. And let's say, like, anything past, this is like a thermometer, anything past this level of evil and suffering, I'm going to supernaturally intervene and stop it from happening. Okay, let's say that's the line. You know what would happen? We would naturally and rightly, like understandably, complain at this level of suffering that we experience. Does that make sense? Because that's the most amount of evil and suffering that we experience. So we would say, oh, God, why don't you intervene and stop? You know, let's say the worst evil that God allowed was people cutting you off in traffic and making you late to appointments. That's just the biggest amount of evil and suffering we'd experience. So we would say, God, why did you allow that to happen? It's kind of like the person who, someone who hasn't had their leg amputated would complain about a broken leg. Someone who hasn't had their leg broken would complain about a cut. Someone who do you understand? Like, we would complain about the worst amount of suffering that we have gone through. So it's just like, where's the line? It's futile. Where do we draw that line? If it's all evil and all suffering, then God has to intervene and prevent free will or prevent people.
It's actually a pretty interesting point. Like when you go around the world, and some of you may have experienced this, like in our society, we complain and are sad and experience suffering about particular things. And you go around the world to like impoverished places, and all of a sudden you see the comparison of what they have and what we have, and yet they're not complaining or being sad or suffering in the same way. It's almost like you come to the richer places, and at times, not all the time, it's almost like some of the people who live in poverty have more joy than the people who have the wealth, right, because they've built up this strength or this tolerance to some of that stress and the suffering or the pain that they've experienced. So there's something really true about that, I think, hey?
Yeah, because we can only complain or make judgments on what we know. So the other response to why God doesn't intervene supernaturally to stop evil from happening is my question of like, well, how do you know God hasn't done that already? We read accounts in the Bible of something like Daniel where like people get chucked into a furnace and burning, fire, and they come out unscathed, or they get chucked in with lions and they come out with, unscathed. And we kind of look for those we want to see that kind of stuff. But I guess my question is, how do we know like God hasn't intervened already to prevent us from being thrown into the metaphorical furnace? How do you know God hasn't already intervened to stop you from being thrown into the lion's den? Suppose on your way here this evening, you were supposed to be in a car crash. Let's say there was a drunk driver, and he or she decided, okay, I'm going to drink and get on the road and cause havoc. But God, and they were supposed to crash into you, and you were supposed to lose both your legs. But God decided to supernaturally intervene, and their tires just blew up in the driveway, and they never made it out onto the road. Like, how do you know that God didn't do that, right? Do you know that God did that or didn't do that? Do you know? Daniel, do you know? No, he doesn't. And if Daniel doesn't know, then how can we possibly know, right? So Psalm 139:5 says, "You hem me in behind and before, you lay your hand upon me." I know it sounds kind of weird. You hem me in behind and before, you lay your hand upon me. What that means is, it basically means that God goes before us and God follows behind us. God is working in our lives to according to his wisdom and purposes. He's got you. He's protecting you. And God is working in the world, and he has his hand upon us. It's this idea of God being our shepherd and protecting us and making sure we're all good. So we want that kind of Daniel intervention, not that Daniel. We want the lion or the fire intervention. But surely God is intervening right now, and surely God is restraining a whole lot of evil that could be taking place. Psalm 103 verse 10 says, "He does not treat us as our sins deserve." Right? He does not treat us as our sins deserve. So, in some sense, God's grace and his mercy towards sinners is that he's dealing to us better than we deserve right now. So my question is, like, how do we know that God isn't already intervening to protect us? Right? And so you could look at any kind of sad thing that happens. Let's say a 12-year-old boy dies of cancer, and how do we know that wasn't God answering our prayers about Hitler, right? How do we know God wasn't taking that dude out so that he doesn't kill 7 million Jews in the future? Or how do we know that God wasn't protecting that child from some even worse suffering and evil that was going to happen? My point is, we don't know. Thank you. We just don't know. And so my point isn't that we're supposed to, like, every bad thing that happens, we kind of look at it and calculate, Noah injured his knee at basketball yesterday, so that's God trying to stop the next Hitler from, coming to fruition. No, we can't. That's not the point. The point is, like, in a world where there is free will, in a world where there is people with free will, there is going to be evil. There is going to be evil. Anything you want to add to that before we break?
Oh, just a couple of thoughts, and I'll just be real quick. And a couple of those, I think, just as Han was sharing, I was like, there's a lot there because we want to know. It's almost like we have to know, right? It's kind of, we see the suffering, we experience it, and that's a real thing. We don't want to water that down, but going from that, it's really hard and very human. It's very hard to accept that without knowing or the control of that. Does that kind of make sense? And so it's like we're kind of asking the questions. We have to know it's okay and that it fits well and everything else. And so we're kind of demanding of God, you've got to give us an answer for this thing for me to be able to accept it almost, And so just as you were sharing, I was just kind of oh man, that's a real hard place for us to be in as humans who don't have knowledge of everything, as well as for God, right? Because he loves us and cares for us. And I'm sure he would want to come down and tell every one of us all the reasons why. They'd take a very long time because we ask a lot of questions. It's like children. We've got young children. They're always asking, why, Dad? Why, Dad? Why, Dad? I'm like, I really want to help you understand, but I don't know that you have the capacity to because you're not an adult yet. Your brain, your prefrontal cortex has not developed to be able to understand. And maybe we don't have the mind of God, right? I don't know.
Yeah, so thanks. So what we're going to do, we're going to take a break. We've spent 26 minutes and 6 seconds on this one, so just to give us a chance to stand up and stretch our legs, but as well as that functional thing of stretching legs, as you know, we find it really, really important that when we come to church, it's about each and every single one of us. So we want to make sure everyone feels welcome, make sure no one has to suffer through church of being on their own and alone. Maybe some of you are like, I have to suffer through talking to new people. Too bad. Don't know why God allows it. So would you please stand? Everyone please stand. Come out of your seats and spend a few minutes saying hi and sign up for dinner. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. Awesome. Well, so we're into the second part. So first part, why does God allow evil? And Han's able to give us some great thoughts there around free will and who God is and where that line would be, and that actually for us as humans, it's actually real hard to kind of think through all the different kind of tangents or the degrees that might go to. In the second part, we're going to be thinking about suffering. Why does God allow suffering? And this has more to do with, as we go through this, more to do with things that aren't directly they don't directly come from some sort of human choice, but more maybe from our natural world. And so when I was thinking about natural kinds of sufferings, we can think of earthquakes and famines and flooding, lots of the flooding that's been happening around the world, the earth warming in particular areas of the earth as well, and the different degrees of suffering that causes. I even think of in my own life, losing hair, it's a bit of suffering, not being able to go and get a haircut anymore, or aging, right, death. Some personal ones. I know we've all got our personal kind of sufferings that are quite natural as well, whether that's something to do with your body or, I know for our family, especially for me as a young child, natural and this idea of suffering was very real for our family because my younger sister was born with cerebral palsy and with brain damage, and so and she ended up passing away when she was quite young, about 3 or 4, and so that kind of idea of natural suffering was quite real for our family, even as a young child, right? Or I think of a woman that we're friends with, and she lost one of her daughters in the Mangatapopo River tragedy ages ago, or quite a few years ago now. And so there's all these kind of ideas of natural suffering. So as we go through this kind of section, I'm just going to be offering some thoughts. I'm not an apologist. I've just got some thoughts around that, and I'm obviously not equipped here to deal to be able to engage all the emotion of it, but just know that we're all human and we've probably all experienced something of this type of suffering, or also we know about it through what we see kind of going on around the world. There's also a difference that I kind of want to make, and that is not all suffering is bad. I see some of the guys out here, they obviously go to the gym and their muscles probably undergo some sort of suffering and stress, right? Stress actually, you probably know, it can be a really negative thing for our body, but it can also be quite a good thing in some ways, because stress, the body uses stress and adrenaline and things like this to actually motivate us, right? And so I just want to make a difference between good suffering or positive suffering and negative suffering. Not all suffering is actually bad. Even as we see our children grow, my younger children, as their bones grow, especially if they have a growth spurt at a very young age. I mean, they start crying at night. And you're like, what's going on? What can I do to kind of make it better? And they're like, nothing. Like, life's just so bad, And so there's this type of suffering that as our bodies are growing, right, that it's actually got a good purpose to it, And I don't know, if the world was meant to be like that, but I kind of think that there was probably a positive kind of element of suffering that God kind of put into the world, just through natural order and natural law as well. So I'm going to do this in two parts. So the first is God allows suffering as a natural consequence of the fall. I've got a couple of thoughts there. And then the second part, perhaps God allows suffering because he's trying to wake us up. So first is God allows suffering as a natural consequence of the fall. And Han kind of gave me a good kind of a way of thinking about this, and that's the ripple effect. You guys probably have heard of that, or the butterfly effect, or and maybe another way of thinking of it is the snowball effect. My kids often take baths at night, or especially the younger two, and they have this this bag net of toys. And when we've filled the bath, they put the bag net of toys into the bath, and as Jack jumps in, water flies out of the bath against the wall, and you can imagine all the toys kind of being disrupted and kind of heaved and turned upside down and things like that, right? And so this kind of idea of God allowing suffering under this kind of ripple effect is that our world and everything in it actually is interconnected in some way, and the closer you are to where the body drops into the water, the bigger effect on the toys in the bath, right? But we live in this system, right? Our world and our universe is a system, and I think everything is connected. And so as one thing changes or as one thing moves, it kind of moves everything else to different degrees in that system. And so when we think of the fall, there's this kind of evil, God's created the world as good, and then all of a sudden something in it starts doing something that it's not meant to do. And that's going to affect, to different degrees, the things in its vicinity, right? Not just what's going on in terms of the objects it's moving, but in terms of the actual environment that it's in. I can't explain how that all works over history. It's just how I've kind of, one of the thoughts that I've kind of, that many people have kind of had is this kind of idea of the ripple effect, that as something changes, it changes everything else in its system. You can even think of families, right? If your family, if you play a role in your family and you start to act outside that role, it'll actually start to change all the other kind of roles or the way people respond in your family, right? So if you don't talk in your family and all of a sudden you start talking, everyone's going to be like, whoa, right? And they'll start kind of responding to that in a different way, and it's kind of like that as well. Another idea, another way of thinking about it, we've got young kids, and so we're often getting sick as our kids' immunity has been built up. Has been built up. Now, if you get sick, is that a localized thing? If you get a virus or a bacteria, I mean, sometimes it's kind of localized, but actually, more often than not, it actually starts to affect many parts of your body. So you can think about the aches and pains. I often know when a cold or something is coming on, not because I'm starting to cough or anything else, but because my knees and my Achilles, which are the weak parts of my body, they actually start to ache. And I'm like, oh man, I'm probably going to get sick. Or you start to feel the heaviness behind your eyes. You start to get tired. Your throat starts to go, right? My taste starts to get a bit funny, the way I taste things, right? So you can think about contracting a virus, often not just a localized thing. It might start somewhere, but it actually starts to spread out into all the other parts of your body and organs as well. And the last would just be if you think about an ecosystem. So if you can think of any type of animal or something like that, it lives within an ecosystem. And if you change something within the environment that it lives in, it's not just going to have changes in the animal itself, but it'll actually start to impact all the other things. So for example, if you take water out of a habitat, what's going to start happening to the trees, to the hydration of the different animals and subspecies that are part of that ecosystem, again, just that ripple effect, one change actually ends up changing to different degrees the different things that are part of that context. So we can think of bad ripple effects. Actually, a good quote. Matt Chandler, I don't know if you know Matt Chandler, he says, building your house doesn't exempt you from the storm. Right, and we know the classic kind of like parable from the Bible. You know, the people who build their house in the sand, people who build their house on the rock. Some of us choose to build our houses in pretty funny places. Yeah, you know, like if we chose to build all of our housing in good places, in healthy places that actually housing's meant to be built in, probably have a lot less tragedy as well, right? You know, and when I think about the world, you know, like, and that's again a really terrible thing. But a lot of poorer people are forced into these areas, right, where like there's not like probably not a good idea to kind of have housing and things. And the poorer that they are, the worse the housing is, the more kind of like diseases and bacteria and viruses and all that sort of stuff kind of happens there. Or some of us decide to build our houses in kind of like terrible locations that do have like massive storms or avalanches or whatever else, right? You know. So there's this bad idea of ripples, you know, whether we think of pollution or overconsumption and overpopulation that affect our kind of natural world. And as we kind of overconsume, that kind of impacts the communities that are in all these kind of like third world countries and things like that, and where they live and what they can afford and how they can take care of themselves and all sorts of things. So there's this bad idea of how the ripple effect kind of impacts us. But also good, right? Like when we think of the environment, and you guys are probably like this, being, what generation are we now? I don't know, what generation are we?
I'm a millennial, that's all I know.
Millennial? What generation are you guys? Z? So I put myself in that Z. Cool. So we're generation. Yeah, and one of the things I love about this generation, right, like, is that there's probably, from at least my experience, which is very limited as one person, but there's like more of a focus and emphasis on the environment, right, you know, than when I grew up. And so, but I love that. Because, you know, like the environment and going out into the forest and going out and enjoying the bush and the beach and all that, like those are wonderful things, yeah? Actually, I had a friend just come back from Santa Monica. I don't know if you've ever been to LA. You go down Santa Monica Boulevard and all this, you see crazy people and all sorts of things, and actually really beautiful beaches, like there's some wonderful places there, but also a lot of pollution. Yeah, you know, and so an environment's a massive thing because that's what we enjoy. That's how we take care of our bodies, and you know, I just wonder, like, you know, the more we take care of our environment now, the more enriched, like, our future generations are going to be, and what they get to experience. Like my children, like now that I have children, I probably care a bit more, but like. Like I really want them to have these environments and contexts, right? Like these healthy environments to kind of grow up in. And so there's like bad ripples that kind of happen all the way back from the beginning with sin and how that's kind of changed environments to how we treat our environments today. And we can have bad effects on our environment that ripple out, and we can have good effects that kind of can ripple out into our world as well. What I think under this first thing is, one other thought before I get there. I also think God, and this is going to be a tricky one, I think, I find it hard, is that God actually has put physical suffering into our natural world. So this is a tricky one. I'll get back to it in the second point a bit, but when we think about this, like not only is there a ripple effect that happens because of humankind or humanity's choices, but also when you go back to Genesis, like what does God do after the fall and after humans rebel? Like death is is the consequence of that, right? Like God allows death into the world. And not just that, he curses the ground and work and thistles and all that, and he also brings in pain and suffering and childbearing, right? You know, and so God actually, it's not just he's sitting back and like letting things naturally happen. Like that is one sort of side. The other side is that like he actually does kind of intervene and allow some pain and suffering into our world. You know, and that's a real hard thing. I'm going to get to maybe a little bit of thought of why he does that in the next point, but that's just a second thought. So from this ripple effect, what are we meant to do with that? And I think a great example in the Bible, when I think about what are we meant to do with that, or what does it give us, is the story of Joseph. Now, you guys have heard of Joseph? If you grew up as a little kid, you might have Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Is that the one? Yep. So he's kind of like thrown into slavery by his brothers, who are really jealous of the love that his father has for him. He gets put down in this pit, then he's taken to Egypt, and he's in prison there, and he interprets dreams, and then all of a sudden, after all of that, he becomes like the 2-eyed sea to the Pharaoh. And then Egypt goes through a massive famine. And what does Joseph do? Like in his wisdom, he helps the nation of Egypt store up enough food for them to be able to get through a famine, right? And so with the ripple effect, I'm kind of like, man, there's so many bad and evil things that happen, a lot of suffering, and it doesn't answer it completely. But as a Christian, I'm like, man, like I can't tell you why they all happen, but I do know that God's given us an opportunity like Joseph to respond to that. Because Joseph is actually like a type, I like to call him a type of Jesus, right? A type of who God is. He's reflecting and helping us see and experience something of who God is. And that God actually, like, we're in this land of famine, in this world of famine, and actually God cares about that. He allows Egypt to go through the famine and the surrounding nations as well for a time. And then after that time, like, is able to respond and intervene. And so imagine if there was a drought in Ethiopia or some other country around the world, and instead of us over-consuming, what if we rushed to the aid of the people with the overabundance of wealth that we actually have? What if the world with its wealth distributed or redistributed it in a way where almost everyone's needs are taken care of? There's so much pain and suffering in the natural world, and we often go, man, like, that's such a big issue, like, where's God in that? And I'm like, man, like, do you not see the abundance of, like, wealth and goodness and resource that God has given us in this world? And where's it all being consumed? What if we cared more about, like, supporting and taking care of people who don't have necessarily the abundance of resource that we have here? What if we distributed to that in a more meaningful way? I wonder, as a result, would disease diminish? I wonder if medical care would be more accessible, and there was decent housing for people. Do we? I know we kind of do here, but what if we didn't have $1 million homes? What if we're able to kind of give more money away to other countries and have, like, I know it might not be possible in this complex world, but actually, like, that's the type of resource that this world has. So that's kind of like one thought, or one part of it. The second part is perhaps God, so that was God allows suffering as a natural consequence of the fall and around the ripple effect. Our second thought is perhaps God allows suffering because he's trying to wake us up. And so with this, I wonder if the chief purpose in life is not actually happiness. Like, it's important, like happiness is an important thing, but what if the chief purpose in life is not actually happiness? But what if it is the knowledge and the worship of God? So in our world, because sin and evil is actually a part of it, maybe natural evils are actually necessary in some way for people to come to a knowledge and worship of God. So Romans 1:19 says this. And I'm going to kind of twist this in a moment, so forgive me if any of you are academic theologians out there, so we'll just go with it. But Romans 1:19 and 20 says this: people are without excuse. They have clearly seen God's eternal power and his divine nature through creation. And this is where I'm going to twist it. I wonder, might we also be without excuse because we can clearly see that something has gone terribly wrong with our relationship with God based on the suffering that we experience in the good of creation? So what I mean, if there was no physical suffering, what might we conclude about our spiritual condition? Like, for example, as a parent, because I'm a parent, if there is no consequence to my child's lying, then what will they believe about it? So if there's nothing wrong with the natural world, what are we going to think about our spiritual life with God and our spiritual need? Relationships. If there is no ramification for my spouse's cheating, then what will they learn or believe about it? If there's no kind of consequence to that. If a thief is not held responsible for stealing, then what are they going to learn or believe about it? There is suffering mixed into every facet of our physical world, and it reinforces the awareness that something isn't quite right. We can look around the world and go, man, there must be something like, it started somewhere. There must be something pretty amazing that can create something out of nothing, something pretty powerful, something pretty intentional, something that's like got a pretty amazing mind, right? That's what kind of the Romans 1 verse kind of shares. So we can kind of look out at the world and kind of see that in a sense, right? But we can also look around the world and go, man, like something's gone off. Like there's a lot of pain and suffering. Like not everything's working like it should. And so on one hand we go, man, like there should be some sort of creator, like amazing creator out there, and something's gone terribly wrong. Now, if we had lost our relationship with God and nothing had gone wrong with our world, well, what would we probably think about our relationship with God? That we were all good, right? We'd be like, man, look, I got no suffering. We're fine. We're all good. Like that's what the natural world tells me, right? Because that's what we experience. And again, I can't answer every question, but I'm just saying, like, to some degree, we can understand that natural suffering within our world actually wakes us up and brings us to an awareness of the spiritual condition of our relationship with God. They are actually inextricably intertwined. We would actually question, if we could put our emotion aside, we would actually question God's goodness and his wisdom if he took away the capacity for us to know our condition. Right? Like, what if he let everything be okay in our natural world, but he knew our relationship wasn't good and he didn't let us see that? Like, what type of God would he be? It'd be like being in a relationship with someone who doesn't want to be in it, but they don't tell you. Yeah? And you'd be like, man, that's terrible. Like, why would you do that? But God's actually going, man, like, no, I want you to be aware. And I'm making it clearly seen that I'm here. And also, the natural world tells us clearly that something's gone wrong. God doesn't always cause evil and suffering, but he does allow it for us to be able to trust him. And probably a couple of examples from the Bible. We can all think of Job. And the terrible suffering that he goes through. Now, God doesn't cause that. As you read through the narrative of that, you actually know that there's like an actual evil origins of that, like evil persons who create that suffering, or God allows to create that suffering in Job's life. And Job and his mates, they all kind of question it. Where does this come from? What have you done? What wrong have you done? You must have done something terrible for this to happen to you, and everything else. And at the end of it, none of them can really answer, like, why God would allow the suffering. But Job's kind of brought to this place of going, man, look, like, I don't know why, but I do know I need to trust God. Like that's all I can do because I'm a limited human. I can't see everything. I can't know everything. I don't know everything happening in the spiritual realms, but I do trust God. We can think of Paul, the Apostle Paul, his thorn in the flesh. He's prays to get rid of this thorn in his flesh. It doesn't go away. And at that time, he'd been given, he had this kind of high rank amongst the new believers and everything else. And he kind of comes to this conclusion, I think it's been left in me because, if everything was okay, maybe I wouldn't be humble. And actually, this thorn has been left in my flesh to help kind of motivate and inspire kind of humility in me. And he says that in this world, maybe in the ideal world, when none of us are kind of selfish or we might not need those thorns, But in this world of evil, and where even our own flesh, right? Our own flesh fights against us sometimes. And I kind of think that's what Paul was talking about. But our own flesh is kind of fighting against us, right? And so he goes, man, like this thorn's been left in my flesh. So I stay humble and dependent and reliant on God. And so those would be my two thoughts. Kind of perhaps God allows suffering because he's trying to wake us up. He leaves the natural world to some degree. Again, I'm not saying he doesn't intervene at times. I really do think he does. But he does allow a degree of evil or suffering in our natural world because he wants us to know and have an awareness that we need to get right with him. And then on the other side, for us to be able to grow that dependence and trust on him.
Yeah, I think the wisdom of God is a huge thing in this, right? We wonder why some things happen, and we look at that and we go, oh yeah, God's trying to wake us up, and sometimes wake us up to what, or maybe he's trying to teach. I wholeheartedly agree. We just can't know, but we can know that God's doing something. Sometimes there's no reason or rhyme to everything, but sometimes God in his wisdom. You think of Job, right? Excuse me. Job, how that ends is God says to Job, Job's like, yo, what's the deal? Why is this happening to me? And then God actually doesn't answer him. God's response to him is like, bro, where were you when I created everything? Where were you? Almost a sense of bro, I'm way bigger than you and my wisdom is up here, and you could just you can trust that I'm doing something. And in talking about this good ripple effect, we just don't know what good ripple effect God is using our suffering for, or what's going to come from it. I know of a pastor who committed some small minor sin, and doesn't matter what it is.
He's sitting down the back of the auditorium, by the way.
yeah. This is an anecdote from this morning, and as a result of that, suffering took place. Suffering took place, and this pastor concluded that maybe the ripple effect of that was that, he became a better pastor and was able to minister as a good pastor without letting the sin get in his way. So it's maybe that's the good ripple effect. And is it satisfying? We don't know. Can we know what the ripple effect is going to be? I don't know. You may have gone through some terrible breakup with someone that you thought was going to be the love of your life, right? And you go, man, this sucks. I'm going through the suffering. But it's who knows? If you get married in the future, you might look back and be like, man, that was the best thing to ever happen to me, that I didn't marry that girl. Because if I married her, then I wouldn't have her and these kids and whatever. So it's we just don't know. But it's we got to trust the wisdom of God that he knows what he's doing, right? He knows what he's doing. And sometimes most of the time, we don't know. We don't know why God is allowing some kind of suffering, but hear me now. We don't know why God is allowing suffering, but if the Bible is true, and if the gospel is true, we know that it's not because he hates us. We know it's not because he's trying to stitch us up. We know it's not because of a lack of love, because the Bible tells us that God, we sang about it this morning, that God loves us and he wants us to know him. I mean, that's our fourth point, right? God, he wants to wake us up. There were, in the Gospels, you read about the Tower of Siloam. Basically, there was an engineering problem and lots of people died, and people asked Jesus, hey, why did this happen? And his answer was basically your God's trying to wake you up. If you don't turn to God, then you're gonna end up like them, so you need to turn to God. So God is trying to wake us up, and there's some kind of, whatever the reason might be, we can know it's not because God doesn't love us. That's a double negative, really hard to understand. God loves us. We can know that, God loves us, and so we can trust him. And I think our mate Clive Staples Lewis, C.S. Lewis, had some great quote, I don't know what, you can Google it, about how God is speaking to us in suffering, something about a megaphone, he's yelling to us. Do you know the quote?
Not by heart, I do know the one.
Yeah. Well, ask Mark after, he'll Google it. But through suffering, God's trying to wake us.
My phone's broken.
He can't, his phone's broken. That's why you don't get Apple products.
Natural
guys.
suffering.
That's your own choice. You went with Apple.
It's like an extension of my body.
So God allows suffering. We don't always know why, but we know that God loves us, and He's trying to wake us up and speak to us.
One other thought too, just as you were sharing, I was like, and this may be true for all of us, right? Like the things that we suffer in, like they often provide meaning. Now, it's not that like God puts the suffering in our life to create that meaning, but He almost redeems the suffering that we experience to create meaning and purpose. Now, without God, our suffering is really meaningless. It's just a bunch of like ideas that we've chucked on to the different feelings that we experience and the different receptors in our body, right? You know, like there's really no meaning to it. It's just what we've come up with. So without God, actually our suffering is meaningless. It's only actually with God that suffering and evil and bad and all that and pain can actually be defined. And I look around the world and I'm like, man, like if you look at so many of the wonderful things that people are doing, it often comes from the suffering, the experiences of suffering they've had in their life. Like I worked for a pastor for a while, this African-American guy, and his wife ended up dying from, not dementia, sorry, mind blank. Sorry? Alzheimer's, thank you. Yeah, so from complications with Alzheimer's, sorry. Well, that's a bad example. Is there a doctor in there? No. So he ended up going through this like really terrible like experience with his wife over a number of years and watching her kind of slowly just worsen and get ill and her body kind of, it was just terrible. And yet for the next kind of 5 or 10 years, like the purpose that he found in life came from supporting other spouses who had spouses going through similar things that he had gone through. And he was able to do that really well because he'd gone through it. It'd be like me if I was trying to support you, but I had not been through what you'd been through, or something like it. You'd probably be like, oh, great, this is good, and you can do that. But actually having someone there who's experienced something of what you've been through, the suffering that you've experienced, is actually really meaningful because you're with someone who knows and understands and feels it. And then they're not trying to fix you or fix it, right? You know, and so that often kind of creates purpose for us. And so, like again, a redeeming thing, right? Like, is like Joseph knew what suffering was like, and famine and poverty was like because he was in prison, he was thrown out by his brothers and everything else, and yet like he found this massive purpose and call from God to actually like care and support not just Egypt, but all the surrounding nations and his own family, right? You know. So if you're suffering somewhere, maybe my question to you would be like, I wonder what God's up to. Like, I wonder what he could do with that. Like, how might he bring his kingdom into this world in some way that someone else might experience him through the very things that you've been through?
Cool. So 2 concluding thoughts, which kind of jumps off one of the things Mark said. The existence of evil and suffering points to the existence of God. I know people try to use this as a way of saying, no, God doesn't exist, but I'm telling us that actually we can flip the script on them and say, I'm not saying that you have to believe in Jesus, but it more likely than not points to the existence of God, whoever he, she, it might be. See, the mere fact that we can see something and recognize it as evil or bad or negative, and the fact that we can see that and go, oh, this must be bad. Now, people disagree what counts as bad or what counts as evil. Sure, that's whatever, you can debate that. But the fact that something evil and bad exists, that is only possible if we put that up against some kind of moral standard. And without the existence of God, there is no ultimate moral standard that we can compare it to, right? Because you might be like, no, it's okay to kill 6 million Jews. And if there's no ultimate standard, then it's like, it was legal at the time. We were allowed to do it. It's like, that's a pretty futile worldview. And so the fact that evil and suffering exists, and that we can look at suffering and say, hey, this is, generally speaking, suffering is a bad thing. The fact that we can look at it and say that that is good or that is bad shows that there is some sense of morality which can only come from God. The ultimate standard has to be God. And so if someone says it points to the fact that there is no God, I think it's actually, you don't need to bash them with your Bible, but I think it doesn't need to be Jesus specifically, but I think it points to the fact that actually there is a God. who has given some kind of moral standard that we can look at things and go, yep, that's good, that's bad. One other closing statement. So just maybe a couple of verses to kind of share. So Romans 8, the Apostle Paul, he writes, the whole creation is groaning because creation itself has been subjected to futility and is in bondage to decay until the day comes when things will be made right again. You know, like our world is groaning in its various ways. It's telling us that something isn't right, that something has gone wrong. Things aren't quite, a lot, how they're meant to be. And, you know, we often ask, hey, look, like, why doesn't God intervene? Well, because he wanted you. If he'd intervened before now, like, we wouldn't be here, and he loves you enough to let the world go on. In terms of the eternal perspective, right, you know, like, and he is going to intervene. The Bible actually promises, yes, he is going to intervene one day. He wanted us to be a part of his in relationship with him and a part of that new world, but he is going to intervene, but he was waiting for us. And this is what it says in Revelation 21. I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth had passed away. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, no more mourning, no more crying, no more pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. So we say, hey, why hasn't God intervened? Well, because like he's enduring the pain and suffering with us as Christ did, right? Like Christ has suffered the things that we have because he wanted us so much. That he's enduring this pain and suffering for a limited time because he is going to finally intervene one day. And he's going to make everything right and actually do away with all the, not the positive suffering, but the negative suffering and pain that this world experiences. So that'd be my closing thought. Thanks, mate. So I'd like to invite the band back up just as we close. And I would invite all of us to please stand before we sing. I would like to read a psalm. That kind of encapsulates what we've been talking about, and I hope we'll prepare our hearts to sing. This is from Psalm 13, where we read, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him. Lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully